We've seen civilians in these moving pictures, and we will soon witness a play written and presented by soldiers. We think of the civilian and the soldier as two separate and very different faces of war, but I've worked with both of them in Afghanistan and other war zones, and I have come to see them as intimately related, intimately connected, fellow sufferers of more encompassing enemies, the violence of neocolonialism and capitalism, the violence of war itself. So I want to speak this evening about a psychological affliction that haunts them both, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. American soldiers are routinely diagnosed and treated intensively for PTSD. Civilians in the same war zone suffer the same symptoms, but having no safety, no money, no health care, no government, they get no diagnosis, no treatment. What is post-traumatic stress disorder? We throw the term around way too loosely, but it has specific psychiatric diagnostic criteria, first defined in 1980 in the third edition of the American Psychiatric Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-3. For diagnosis of PTSD, the patient must have suffered a sudden catastrophic event threatening imminent death that caused him to feel intense fear, helplessness, and horror. Fear, helplessness, and horror. Initially, that catastrophic event had to be outside the range of usual human experience. That phrase was dropped in DSM-4, published in 1994, because psychiatrists finally realized that war itself is outside the range of usual human experience, and conversely, that catastrophic events are perfectly usual in war. Further, according to the diagnostic manual, PTSD is marked by distinctive clusters of symptoms that persist long after the traumatic event. For diagnosis, the patient must suffer from at least one such cluster. Many suffer from all of them, just as civilians do. First, intrusive recollections of the traumatic event, such as flashbacks or nightmares. Second, constriction of emotion and avoidance of any situation reminiscent of the trauma. This appears as emotional numbing, detachment, and estrangement from other people and activities, shutting down. Third, hyperarousal, emerging in exaggerated startling, hypervigilance, irritability, outbursts of anger, and the inability to concentrate or to fall asleep. Many of these symptomatic behaviors in soldiers can be explained as adaptations to life in a war zone where people are trying to kill you. And they may gradually disappear over time at home if they are not complicated by additional problems like alcohol and drug abuse. Civilians suffer the same symptoms. I tested off the diagnostic charts myself simply by living too long in war zones. For veterans, this is what makes reintegration at home so difficult. For civilians in a war-ravaged country where the whole population is likely to be traumatized, this is what makes rebuilding a peaceable country a project that consumes generations. PTSD has a history. It was added to DSM-3 specifically to cover retroactively the troubled veterans of America's war against Vietnam. A couple of prominent psychiatrists who had led rap groups in New York City for members of Vietnam vets against the war in the 1970s pushed for it. They said that what vets suffered was different from ordinary depression or anger management problems. Robert J. Lifton, in particular, wrote about the unresolved death guilt of the anti-war vets and the sparks that ignited their rage. He wrote of their habit of violence, the tendency to use violence as an absolute solution to the slightest threat, and of their profound sense of betrayal, the sense of having been victimized, badly used, or as they often put it, fucked over, and put in a situation in which they both slaughtered people and suffered for no reason. They directed their rage toward political leaders, the Veterans Administration, any figures of authority. But Lifton reports there was a special kind of rage reserved for the military. Notice that PTSD is unlike any other psychiatric illness described in DSM-3 or any of the subsequent diagnostic manuals. It does not arise from the patient's own psyche. Instead, it comes out of the blue, all of a sudden, and smashes him or her from the outside. The same kind of thing happens all the time in war zones to civilians. Lifton and others took this as evidence that no matter what a victim's personal psychological history might be, he or she could be totally remodeled by war. And that is precisely what people have said from ancient times to the present about so many returned veterans. They are changed. But at the same time in the 1980s, psychoanalytic psychiatry as practiced at Veterans Administration's hospitals in the United States insisted on sticking to the Freudian talking cure. It assumed that a patient's outward symptoms of PTSD were manifestations not of his moral outrage or his politics, but of the unspeakable catastrophic trauma he was trying to exclude from consciousness, and that only by dragging that trauma into consciousness or some childhood trauma behind it could that patient be healed. Since the aim of VA counseling was to get the patient to speak about the traumatic event, the counselor was instructed to remain steadfastly non-judgmental. So I ask you, what kind of treatment can a non-judgmental Freudian therapist give to an angry vet who has already reached all kinds of judgments about the morality of the war and the politics of the national leaders who sent him to fight it? Well, we might have to call that medical treatment. And indeed, in the US, the medicalization of the war against Vietnam silenced the narrative of those sick veterans and established the outrageous atrocity that was that war against Vietnam as normal procedure for the American military. Another matter of history, also at the same time, about 1980, feminist researchers pointed out that they had already described an affliction that looked just like PTSD, and that they had called rape trauma syndrome. Feminists had also found the same symptoms in both battered women and incest victims who commonly are raped over and over again. In a classic book, Trauma and Recovery, psychiatrist Judith Herman proposed another diagnosis for the DSM. She called it complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The term applied, Herman argued, to the more profound suffering of those who endure not a single catastrophic event, but repeated traumatic events over an extended period of time. Some people, she said, are trapped in situations where they are made to face that terrible sense of powerlessness and fear, and the paralyzing fear of imminent death over and over again. Such a relentless assault upon the self should be recognized as a different category of damage. In proposing this, Herman was not thinking of combat soldiers, but of battered women under threat of death, repeatedly subjected to rape and battery. But she had hit upon the very thing that battered women and soldiers have in common, the very thing that soldiers and civilians in war zones have in common. Psychiatrists have known since World War I that the disorder then called shell shock was a form of hysteria, a collection of symptoms often presented by women victims of sexual violence. In the best of all possible worlds, feminists and veterans might make common cause and work to end war. But no, the Pentagon is not happy with the suggestion that glorious war trauma resembles anything like a girly affliction. Instead, they campaigned to rename PTSD as PTSI, not a post-traumatic stress disorder, but an injury. And many in the military argue that PTSI should be rewarded with a Purple Heart, the American decoration usually given to soldiers who suffer physical wounds in combat. Needless to say, nobody has ever suggested that raped and battered women should get medals for the combat trauma they've gone through, nor should the civilians in our foreign wars. But missing from this controversy and from the treatment of PTSD itself is any consideration of the unresolved death guilt or the immense sense of betrayal that Robert Lifton reported, and that many veterans of America's recent wars feel every bit as strongly as did the vets of Vietnam. The standard diagnosis, whether of disorder or injury, leaves no room for soldiers to speak of guilt or rage, of slaughter or suffering. Yet many suffer enormous guilt, knowing that America's wars and the things they did or witnessed there were based on lies and the ambitions of war profiteering corporate America. Nevertheless, the medicalization of war trauma remains standard procedure today, though the time-consuming talking cure has given way, under pressure from big pharma, to quick prescriptions for opioid narcotics. The Pentagon now finds PTSD to be relatively common and luckily quite useful in raising citizen sympathy for soldiers, defusing opposition to Washington's wars, and transforming into mental health problems the rage and despair of veterans that might raise once again those inconvenient political and moral issues. Today, some psychiatrists speak of the moral injury of soldiers. But so far has America come from the days when moral principles had something to do with the conduct of our wars and our soldiers, that even when returning veterans take their own lives and or murder their wives or children or fellow soldiers or total strangers here at home, as uncounted hundreds of American soldiers have done, advocates will speak up to blame not the homicidal soldiers, nor the officers who misled them, nor the presidents who hurled them into needless wars of choice, nor Congress, nor the citizens who looked the other way, and certainly not war itself. No, not at all. Today, we pin it all on PTSD, a sickness of the mind which happily can be treated with a pill. And as for those traumatized civilians of countries where we wage war, well, they'll just have to get over it.